Listen to these 8 bars of music. Describing emotions, you could say that it's nostalgic and a bit warm but sad, among other things, especially in the last 4 bars. How did I achieve this? To explain, I need to briefly discuss functional harmony in music. Let's say we have a major key, in this case C major. In any key, we have 7 basic chords, or triads, that arise from the key, which in this case are C major as the 1, D minor as the 2, E minor as the 3, F major as the 4, G major as the 5, A minor as the 6, and B diminished as the 7. You may notice that there are certain chords that are major, certain chords that are minor, and one chord that is diminished. Now the important thing about this is that the spots in which certain chords are major and others minor are always the same in any major key. Major chords are always the 1, 4, and 5, and minor chords are always the 2, 3, and 6, no matter what major key it is. Now, when you're writing a chord progression, you can't just select from these chords at random. Well, you can, but it's not going to sound like coherent music. There are certain conventions that we typically follow, the most important being that a phrase, or at least an introductory phrase, will typically start on the 1 chord, which mostly establishes the key. The second most common is how we end a phrase, through a resolution. Typically, a resolution occurs when the 1 chord is reached again at the end of the phrase, sometimes on the last chord, but more often on the first chord of the next phrase. Now, there are certain chords that lead into the 1 chord particularly well, the most common of which is the 5 chord. If you have listened to any music ever, I can guarantee you have heard this resolution hundreds of thousands of times. In addition to this, typically the chord that comes before the 5 chord is either the major 4 or the minor 6. So, for example, a very generic progression following these conventions is major 1, minor 6, major 4, and major 5. It's completely devoid of emotions, but it illustrates the point. Now, let's look at the excerpt I showed you at the beginning. We have a major 1, a minor 3, a major 4, a major 5, pretty normal, okay. Back to 1, a diminished 3, a major 4 and a minor 4 add 6. What's going on here? Well, these are non-diatonic chords. That is, a chord that is not produced by the natural notes of the key, and are actually what provide the specific emotion that is the focus of this video. Mostly our focus is on the last chord, the minor 4 chord. This chord is such an incredible tool of emotion, so let me explain its use. Basically, if there's any tangible scale we can put music on, it's brightness versus darkness. The most blunt example of this is major versus minor, with major having a more elevated note pattern as opposed to minor, and thus being brighter, with minor being darker. These terms are misleading, however, as brightness versus darkness does not equal happy versus sad. It's better to think of the two attributes as separate, and the emotion of the music being separate from this brightness scale, which we will call the modality. As a matter of fact, we can demonstrate this with this 2x2 table right here. We can have happy music in a major key, we can have happy music in a minor key, we can have sad music in a minor key, and as the topic of this video, we can have sad music in a major key. Now, these two counterintuitive spots are made in these modes, but are often achieved by taking some elements from the opposite mode. For example, in the painfully amateur-written Eclipsed Triumph, its main theme is composed of these 4 chords, repeated once. You may notice here that the 3rd chord is not a diatonic chord. In this case, this phrase and entire piece is in A minor, so the 4 chord should be a minor 4, in this case D minor. There's a different pattern for minor keys, but in this bar we raise the 6th of the key to add some brightness to the chord, making it a D major chord. Side note, I did not do this intentionally. This was actually my very first ever piece that I composed, sort of. so obviously there's no way I knew about modality and chromatic application and stuff like that. No, this was actually a mistake. See, before I had internalized the patterns of keys and how they relate to each other and stuff like that, I would actually look up the Wikipedia page of the key and look at the diatonic chords there. Double side note, I talk about doing this with disdain, but honestly, if you're a beginner composer who hasn't yet internalized the diatonic chords and how they relate to the key, I recommend looking up these pages as well. I must have accidentally mistaken this for D major instead of D minor, wrote that down on my notepad or whatever, and went about the entire piece placing down F sharps without ever stopping to think about why I was placing an accidental down if these are meant to be diatonic chords. This mistake, by some miracle of mediocrity, actually did work out in my favor, as it achieved this effect, sort of. As for the sad music in a major key, which is what this video is about, we can achieve it by taking some elements from the opposite mode, in this case minor, and we can do this by lowering the 6th of the key in this bar to create a minor 4 chord instead of the diatonic major 4. Now, you can have this on its own, but typically the minor 4 chord is most effective if it immediately follows a major 4 chord. As well, remember when I talked about resolutions earlier with the major 5 and stuff like that? Well, the minor 4 chord is also a really effective chord to resolve to the major 1. Which is why this major 4 to minor 4 idea is often placed at the end of a phrase. So, our first example chord progression with this idea would be major 1, minor 3, major 4, minor 4. Now that you know the use of the minor 4 chord, here are some bonus tips for using it. 1. The minor 4 chord is an extremely powerful chord. It's sort of like the punchline of a joke, but instead of a burst of humor, it's more of a stab of emotion, and so it must be used in moderation. Here are 2 examples to illustrate this. One is where I did not follow this guideline, and the other is where I did. The first ever official piece that I used this in was my third piece, Strings, in the last movement E. Ignoring the messiness of the accompaniments and engraving, you'll notice that the minor 4 chord is extremely common throughout the movement, and that's because this entire piece is literally just the same 4 chords over and over again. Why is there a major 3 here? We'll get to that in a bit. This is mainly a poor choice of harmony, since if you repeat it over and over again, then it starts to lose its power and just becomes repetitive rather than emotional. Whereas the most recent piece that I use this in is in, well, my most recent piece, Triangle Tremolo, mainly in this section. And despite being 73 bars long, only 5 of them contain a minor 4 chord. This, in my opinion, makes them so much more impactful, and thus I consider this music to be much better. Now, one thing to note is that this piece is in A major, so the minor 4 chord is in D minor, and yet in these bars we also see a B? What's going on here? This brings us to the second tip. Suspensions. In a minor 4 chord, there are 2 options for an extra note that you can add to create even more an emotion, an add 9 or an add 6. To illustrate the use of each of these, here's a normal minor 4 chord progression, and here's a progression with the minor 4 add 9, and here's a progression with the minor 4 add 6. The add 6 is my favorite, and it's the one you see here in Triangle Tremolo with this B. 3. Inversions. With most chords, you want the lowest note, the bass note, to be the root of the chord, unless you really know what you're doing. This I don't advocate against for the minor 4 chord, but you could also get away with having the 3rd, 5th, or even the add 6 we talked about earlier being the bass note as well. You may notice that the 5th of the minor 4 chord also happens to be the tonic of the key, which has some uses were you to use it as the bass note. For example, at the end of the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Serenade for strings. Now, to construct a basic progression of this, we have the tonic chord as the first chord, the major 4 chord as the third chord, and the minor 4 chord as the fourth. Now, this just leaves the second chord, and we actually have a lot of options for what to put here, but the most functional are those of the major 5, the minor 3, the major 3, or the diminished 3. Let's go through these one by one. The major 5 chord is a rather uncommon choice for this second spot, not because it sounds bad, but because people so often choose the other 3. It works in a similar manner to the minor 3 chord, in the sense that it is a very vanilla option, which has plenty of use. Anyways, here's what it sounds like. The minor 3 chord is probably the most common choice since it's just as vanilla as the major 5, but a little bit more emotionally effective. There's really not too much distinction. Here's what it sounds like. The major 3 is made basically by stealing that raised 7th from the relative minor key, but in the major tonality. It has this sort of feeling of angst, like it wishes to rise to the next chord. I use this a lot until Triangle Tremolo, which happens to be the first time that I haven't used it in this scenario. Needless to say, it has a lot of emotional power and sounds like this. And finally, my favorite is the diminished 3, made by lowering the 7th of the major key. It's interesting, sometimes lowering the 7th sounds heroic and triumphant, and sometimes it sounds nostalgic, like we intend here. It also has this similar pull to the major 3, but its dissonance from the tritone adds so much to the emotion of the music. This is the chord that you see me using in the excerpt from the beginning of the video. Also, sometimes this chord isn't written as a diminished 3, but as a dominant 1, with that tonic note in there as well, but the effect is basically the same. As for inversions, typically instead of putting this chord in root position, we like to have the lowered note as the bass, if you want a descending bass line like this. Anyways, this is what it sounds like. So there you have it. For my fellow string orchestra students out there, here's a list of every piece I bothered to check which has some use of the minor 4 chord or something similar. You hopefully now have a better understanding of how certain music portrays this type of nostalgic emotion, and maybe you can write your own sad phrases now. Anyways, I'll see you wait, there's a bit of runtime left. That's because it's time for one bonus dip. Chromatically descending bass lines. This is a specific 8-bar progression, which also has a version in the minor key with some cool effects of its own. Basically, the progression is as follows. Major 1, minor 3, diminished 3, major 4, minor 4, major 1, major 4, and major 5. Although we specifically choose certain notes from these chords to be the bass note, as to have the bass line descend chromatically. I mean, it still works if you put them all in root position, except for maybe the second major one, but it doesn't have the full effect. Anyways, this is what it sounds like. You can see here that the minor 4 chords and 2 of the second chord options from earlier are in here, which means that it has this nostalgic effect. The version in the minor key isn't necessarily nostalgic, as it falls more into this part of the modality and emotion table than the part we've been talking about. But anyways, the progression is as follows. Minor 1, major 5 or augmented chord of raised 7th, major natural 7th or major 3, major 4, major 6, minor 1, minor or major 4, and major 5. As you can see, it's much looser on the minor side of things, please don't quote that out of context, and I don't care to explain a whole lot in this video, but basically both patterns are up to modification as well. That's perhaps the number one thing you should come away from this video with. There are not set rules, there is no such thing in music. There are guidelines in order to make your music sound more coherent, but don't worry about sticking to exact formulas as long as you understand why music sounds like it does. Best regards, good luck composing, and I will see you later.